Hello and welcome to Bright Past Brilliant Future, another Aston Originals podcast from Aston History. I'm Brian Sudlow, lecturer in history. The mission of the Aston University archives includes recovering stories from the history of the university about colleagues who have had a major impact. And the topic of today's podcast is just such one story. The 9th of February will mark 2 years since the death of Professor Jim Shields. Holding a chair in French politics and modern history, Jim, who retired only in 2018, boasts the double distinction of being Aston's last professor of French and its first professor of history. Jim was still with us in 2017 when, together with Professor Stefan Mans and myself, he went to plead the case for the launch of the history programme, which flourished after his departure. Jim served 2 terms on the staff at Aston University from 1984 to 1990, and then from 2010 until his retirement in 2018. Between these 2 periods, he spent 20 years at the University of Warwick, where he excelled as a scholar of distinction and a highly gifted teacher. And it's with colleagues who connected with him at both his institutions that this podcast will attempt to outline in the next 45 minutes or so some of the things that made Jim the exceptional individual that he was. We're here to remember Jim, but also to discuss the wider significance of his scholarship, his teaching, and the changes that he lived through in nearly 40 years of academic life. This is a many-layered story, and like all histories, it can only conjure a few fragments that will evoke something of Jim's journey over many years. So, not for the last time here, I will cite a favoured French saying of Jim's, "Pas une minute à perdre, mes chers amis." We've got a lot of ground to cover, but we'll manage it with the help of today's guests. With me in the studio is Professor Pamela Moores, Professor Emerita of Modern Languages, who was already a lecturer at Aston when Jim arrived and who in 2010, as head of the School of Languages and Social Sciences, brought him back to the university. Pam, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
So look, mention of Glasgow takes us neatly back to Jim's origins in Scotland, where he grew up 20 miles east of Glasgow in a council house in the village of Calder Crooks in North Lanarkshire. Jim, the middle of 3 children, was hugely proud of these working class origins. His father was for many years a miner, and much later Jim saw to it that his father received the medal belatedly awarded to the Bevan Boys, the wartime conscripts who served in the coal mines rather than on the battlefields of the Second World War. 2 things emerged in Jim's childhood which would distinguish him throughout his later life: his exceptional intellectual talent and his skill and enthusiasm on the football field. In 1979, he earned a first-class master's degree in French and Hispanic studies with moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, where he took the prize for moral philosophy in the first year and the prize for modern languages in the final year. And as for the football, well, we're going to return to that topic later on with Craig and Stephen. Jim remained attached to these Scottish roots and was close with his family throughout his life. But like many Scots, he found his professional path lay outside of Scotland. First, he served for a year as lecteur at the University of Caen in Normandy. And in 1984, he arrived at what was then called the University of Aston in Birmingham, where he would meet you, Pam. What are your memories of Jim from that time?
Well, very, very positive. I'd arrived at Aston in 1978, having worked previously at Warwick. And then Jim came to Aston in 1984, moved to Warwick in 1990, and then returned to Aston as professor in 2010. So one of the things that brought us very much together over the years was sharing experiences, both of us, of having worked in these 2 same universities. Jim's recruitment in 1984 was overseen by a relatively new Vice-Chancellor, Sir Frederick Crawford. He was Birmingham born and educated, and he'd just returned to the UK after 20 years at Stanford, California. He was intent on raising Aston's reputation. After 1 year in post, he'd opened the first science park in the UK, and then he introduced what was called a mobility scheme at Aston, letting go many experienced older members of staff in order to recruit, and this was really how he saw it, young lecturers with first-class degrees.
Yes, the first class was important.
It was really important, yes. Yeah. He prided himself on applying stringent standards. He talked of being a talent spotter and appointing the very best. Now, you've talked already of Jim's brilliant performances in his hires as an undergraduate, as a postgraduate at Glasgow. So he stood out repeatedly, didn't he, as one of the top students. He really fitted Crawford's bill.
Yeah.
For both of us, Jim and myself, coming to Aston after studying in more traditional universities, Cambridge in my case, Glasgow in his, this was a big change, but a change which offered many opportunities. As we all know, Aston was and still is focused primarily on engineering, sciences and business, and had a philosophy and environment dominated very much by the drive to demonstrate contemporary relevance. We'd both spent several years conducting doctoral research on a 19th century novelist, Stendhal in Jim's case and Vallès in mine. And these were both authors keen to reflect the major changes underway in French society in a century of ongoing industrial and political revolution. Aston at that time, Aston Modern Languages, was powering its own revolution of a sort, with an innovative curriculum focused on practical use of the language in the context of knowledge of and familiarity with the country in which the language is used today. That was a far cry from the staple diet of lectures on literature of other countries, delivered for the most part in English in many institutions, which I had experienced, where spoken languages were really undervalued. At Aston, under the leadership of Professor Dennis Ager, sociolinguistics scholar, and Frank Knowles, computational linguistics, language study was delivered in the target language with native speakers at hand and a very strong focus on today's world. So it really was different.
Jim must have felt at home. I mean, he'd just come from Caen. He would have been speaking French all the time. So
precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the people who were recruited were always people who, at that point in time, who wanted to use the language. And the languages taught were French, German, and Russian. Though later, of course, Russian. There was a move to close Russian in many universities.
Yeah, of course. I suppose the other thing that's interesting here is there's literary studies and literary studies. Jim, as I understand it, when he arrived as a Stendhal scholar, was very much interested in Stendhal from the point of view of history of ideas. In fact, his PhD is Stendhal, a study in philosophy, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I think that those of us who had a literary background were often selected. I mean, I shouldn't say often because there weren't many of us over the years. We were selected because of the sort of literature we were interested in. And Vallès likewise, he's a political revolutionary, a communard. So there we had something in common. We were interested in literature, but very much from a social and political point of view.
Yeah. Sam, can you show Jim's graduation picture? Jim, as I understand it, didn't have his PhD when he arrived, but he had to finish his PhD. That was part of the deal, wasn't it? And he worked, as I understand, night and day to get that finished. He graduated in 1989. Jim had switched from Stendhal towards Le Front National, the National Front, as it was in 1984, which had just made its big breakthrough. Alistair, I wonder if you can take up the story from there, because of course you were a colleague of Jim's at Aston, but then you also saw him from those early days of his work in political science, which is then the direction he went in.
I was just thinking back on the great collaboration with Jim over the years, and it to just sort of resituate when I first met Jim. I'll say a little bit about that and a little bit about Aston before perhaps coming on to his shift. Because I was myself at the University of Caen in France. I was a maître de conférence, and I came over in 1987. I remember very well the first time I met Jim. He was, I had my slightly nerve-wracking interview with Sir Fred Crawford, if you remember, and or Professor Crawford, anyway, as he
time, yeah.
The VC, who was pretty hands-on, quite aggressive in some senses. But anyway, I think that the feel at Aston was very dynamic. After my interview, I was very nervous. I went with Jim for coffee, Jim and Susan Milner, who was another colleague, and immediately we hit it off. I mean, this mix of very sharp observation and very friendly welcome, to be honest. And Jim always had that mix. He was never in any sense sort of, he was always very friendly and welcoming, but not at all complacent. He wanted those standards, and he was a brilliant guy. Just one anecdote before I come on to your National Front question. From about the earliest day, he called me Ali. I think he's about the only academic that calls me Ali ever. That's my family called me Ali, but no academics do. But Jim did, and it sort of stuck. So he would always call me Ali. I mean, just thinking back on those years. I mean, there was and I would actually like to pay a sort of retrospective thanks really for Aston University, because if you think about it, they recruited some very, very talented people. I mean, Jim Shields was there, Susan Milner, Gino Raymond, John Gaffney, myself, Helen Drake shortly after, Myri McLean. It's like a roll call of people who were to perform a really important role in studying contemporary France, either from the area of studies or perhaps more political science perspective. And in a sense, and the mix was very good. It's true that most of us left Aston after a short while, but people did come back. And I think we created this cluster, this network that remained important and still remains important actually today. One of the projects we did was the book that became French Political Parties in Transition, which was a book I edited, but that was very much an Aston project. Jim had his first real chapter there, I think, on the Front National. Jim's chapter was on the FN. It was widely cited, widely used by students. Most of the other colleagues were also involved in that book. So in a sense, that Jim's, and I think he was just about finishing off his PhD at the time. So how on earth he found the time to do that as well as everything else, I'm not quite sure, to be honest.
I think, as you said before, Alistair, he was a very hard worker, and he was a perfectionist, and he was very driven.
He was very hard worker, and as you say, a perfectionist. I mean, that's the one thing I would take about Jim. I mean, he would rewrite his things forever. Now, that's not a criticism, actually. It's a sort of compliment. But, he was a real perfectionist, Jim. And he wouldn't accept it until it was absolutely right. I remember that chapter on the Front National one in the French Political Parties in Transition. I mean, he didn't want to let me have it, really, because he kept wanting to improve it. I mean, it was a great chapter anyway, but he would keep wanting to improve it. And so when Jim left, I kept the contact with him mainly on a personal and professional level. I mean, I had some things to do with Warwick. I was external for a couple of times when Jim was there, but it was mainly through the French politics networks. I mean, he got involved in the PSA a lot, the Political Studies Association. I mean, we had a French politics group, and Jim was very active in that. But of course, his name to fame in a way was really the Front National and his great book, Extreme Right in France. What people don't know is that Jim knew the Le Pens very well. He knew Jean-Marie Le Pen. He'd spent time with him. He was invited to the garden. I mean, and I'm just thinking back, because obviously Jean-Marie Le Pen passed away the other week, and thinking, actually, Jim was the one, of all the British scholars maybe, Jim was the one who could have actually legitimately said that I kind of knew this clan, I mean, not just Jean-Marie, but the family.
Can I just mention? I mean, the book had some extraordinary reviews by some extraordinary figures. Pierre Nora of the Académie Française said, "Ce beau travail d'une grande richesse d'information et d'analyse." So a wonderful work with marvelous information and analysis. Robert Paxton said it complimented it for its very impressive thoroughness and exactitude. And Rod Kedwood complimented also the admirable scholarly verve and called it a brilliant book. Just to translate that for people watching the podcast, that's a little bit like a physicist getting amazing reviews from Stephen Hawking, Peter Higgs, and Albert Einstein, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the thing with that, I mean, that was the great book.
Yeah.
It took him a long time. I know we talked about this quite often. It took him a long time, and he was a perfectionist, but it was a great book. And I think, that's I suppose we could say, how many citations has it got in Google Scholar, whatever? I mean, it's got lots actually, but that's not the point. I mean, this is a great book, well received by the very much the leading figures in the field. I'd also like to just say about Jim that, I mean, he wasn't, he became, I mean, in a way, he went from Standard, became a party leadership expert, but more than that. I mean, his work on departmental level party organization was quite impressive, really. His ability to get funding. He got this big Leverhulme grant. So I mean, I think he was multi-talented actually, and some of this was overlooked. I mean, I think in a way I'm glad that he came back to Aston.
Yeah,
because in a sense, with all due respect to Warwick, which is of course a fantastic institution, but I mean, I think in a way Jim was the sort of scholar who should have been at Aston, really, because he was able, with some other scholars that we won't talk about today, but in a sense that he had that, I think, really good mix of impact, needing to be impactful, being impactful, combining different agendas, and not accepting, in a sense, any complacency. So I think Jim was actually, just to finish on this, Jim was a great guy. He was a great scholar. He was a great teacher. I remember at Aston, just briefly, and this is a personal anecdote, but he was also a pretty good looking guy, actually. So we'd have this, as we were all young, 20 somethings or 30, early 30s, and Jim made an impact when he was teaching. Clearly, his teaching was powerful, and I think that remained with him. And so we created a fairly tight knit network, and we kept in contact right up until, I mean, the last time I saw it, I've been out of the UK for 10 years now. So the last time I saw Jim was actually, I think, in Cardiff. I think we had a political studies association there. I certainly remember going in Belfast with him around various whiskey bars. Well, we had a couple of whiskies in pubs in Belfast, but he was a great social animal as well.
Alistair, let's draw a curtain of discretion over that particular moment. And thank you very much for those memories. Probably just one last thing to mention, which was the Hoffman Prize of 2007. He won the Hoffman Prize for the Political Science Association. Probably worth again mentioning for the listener that Stanley Hoffman was one of the great figures of who wrote about the history of France. Jim was completely in awe of Hoffman, and it was one of the great moments of his career to get the prize, receive the prize from Hoffman, and so on. Jerry, I'd like to bring you in at this point because indeed well before the Hoffman Prize and the monograph, Jim had arrived at University of Warwick, and I think you arrived perhaps just shortly afterwards, and you became then colleagues for many years.
Yeah, he's a quite private guy in some ways, but just to confirm, I can't remember seeing him more pleased about anything really than getting that Stanley Hoffman Prize. He was really chuffed with that. I can't speak with Alistair's authority about Jim's research. Safe to say that I did use some of it sometimes for teaching purposes, and it always struck me that not only did it seem impeccable in terms of research quality, it was always very direct, and you could give it straight to students and they could understand it without any mediation. So that's not an easy thing to pull off. If I'm going to talk, I guess, from a colleague's point of view, but it'll be focused on his reputation as an engaging, but also a kind of uniquely effective teacher, as far as I saw it. And I don't think it was based on, we're urged these days to develop all kinds of complicated and innovative pedagogical techniques, but that wasn't Jim's way at all, really. He was just get into the lecture room, get into the seminar room, and he'd just be there, and he'd interact, and he'd perform, and he'd get stuck into whatever the matter at hand was, and that's how he operated. And I remember I think he was probably the first person to get to what's become institutionalized now as a Warwick Award for Teaching Excellence.
Yeah. 2005,
to get it.
Yep.
2007 was.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Because in those early days, obviously, all the great teachers were kind of queuing up to get it, whereas it gets, as the years go, it probably gets slightly easier. But I had to assemble that portfolio of evidence as it was at the time. And I just remember students falling over themselves, really, to you didn't have to go chasing them up. If they heard somebody was giving a testimonial, you'd get other students saying, please, can I give one too? And they were all intimidatingly glowing, really.
As I was preparing for the podcast, I chatted to David Lees, your colleague now at Warwick, and of course he was an undergraduate at Warwick, and he said Jim's teaching was extraordinary, and it was also he commented on the fact Jim moved between different things. He also at Warwick, in addition to teaching on modern and contemporary France, the course, he also taught Enlightenment philosophy too, I guess going back to his sort of history of philosophy background.
Absolutely. I mean, that was based on his Rousseau, Montesquieu, etc.
Yeah.
No, that was he was all across that, but from his thesis.
Yes.
Obviously, he'd always be all across whatever he was teaching. You have to say that. And I think Stephen and Craig will be able to give a student perspective on some of this, but I'll just pick up a few things maybe that I kind of feel I noticed from seeing him teach or seeing him perform at things like open days and so forth. One was his kind of really unusual ability to, whatever the motley group of students in the room were, they'd soon feel like they were part of a cohesive group with a purpose. Ever from, since his trademark entrance of chers amis and what would kind of come from there, you'd always feel that you were you're getting stuck into something substantial when Jim was there. Even with slightly potentially drier material, he'd always find a way in somehow. He'd bring back stuff from his research visits. Alistair talked about him knowing Le Pen. I remember him talking about those. He also knew Pierre Poujade, who was still around when Jim was teaching in the 90s. And I remember Jim talking about his visits to, from the sounds of it, it sounded like Pierre Poujade's country pile. Did he have a country pile? I don't know.
He may well
He would go there and he would tape it and he would bring back some of this stuff to feed into his teaching. And I remember even after his retirement, when I was trying to put together something on French presidents and the media just for teaching purposes, he sent me a link to a video of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, aristocratic French former president, well known for trying to, as it were, get down with the kids in slightly cringeworthy fashion. And this was Giscard d'Estaing playing football or captaining a football team of his in his local, where he was mayor. And well, Giscard was hopeless, which made for the sort of comic material of the video. But I always wonder when I'm using it, what Jim would have made of it, particularly because he was a much better centre forward than Giscard d'Estaing.
I'm sure he was.
As Stephen and Craig will be able to testify.
I'm sure he was. Thank you very much, Jerry. If I could turn to Craig and Stephen. I also chatted to Professor Christopher Thompson before this podcast, and I think it was Professor Thompson who brought Jim to Warwick, and he said to me specifically he knew what a good teacher Jim was, and he wanted to bring those talents over to Warwick. Craig and Stephen, you were right there on the front ranks benefiting from that. So tell us about your memories of Jim as well.
Well, me and Stephen have actually been good friends for a number of years now, but we weren't at Warwick together. But when Stephen joined Birmingham, sort of 7 years behind me, it was in large part the kind of reminiscences and memories of Jim and using some of Jim's phrases that helped bond us as friends. I first met Jim as a final year undergraduate when I had a couple of problems with my year abroad. So I joined final year a couple of weeks late into the term and had to try and persuade Jim to let me on to his special subject Stendhal module that he was running, which was a small group of about 5 or 6. And he was quite reluctant in the first instance to do it. I think he just thought, who's this chancer? Why has he arrived late and so on? But I managed to sort of persuade him to let me on because I'd already read quite a few of the works that were on the on the course. And I think once I'd sort of earned my sort of stripes, won my spurs or whatever, he sort of let me in, and that was the start really of quite a long association with Jim, not just as my teacher in final year, but he was then my supervisor for my master's and my PhD. In addition to that, I also served as a hall tutor in the halls of residence for which Jim was a warden. So I did 3 years of that as well. And that was a very kind of different association to the one that I had with him as my sort of supervisor. So yeah, it was a kind of a many layered relationship. But Gary touched on the Jim as teacher, and I'd just like to say, I mean, I've been kind of lecturing for close to 30 years now, and Jim was the sort of inspiration for so much of that, not just the material, but the techniques, as well as to how to try and win over a room, how to kind of talk to people. It was the kind of the relish and the appetite and the enthusiasm that he had for the material, the way that he'd sort of draw you into it. And I just tried to adopt some of those things in my own kind of teaching technique. I mean, there must have been days when he went into a classroom, kind of tired or not feeling up for it, but you never knew that. They always managed to get the energy. Stephen, do you want to come in at this point and add a few things?
Saying there, yeah. So I'd like to spare Craig his blushes, but Craig is also the winner of a University Teaching Excellence Award at Birmingham, and I can absolutely see, having worked with Craig and actually co-taught with Craig on some occasions, all of that influence that Jim has had. So I can see, Jim's example, the techniques, the energy, the persona come through in Craig's work. I saw Jim for the first time, it must have been autumn 1994 when I began as an undergraduate at Warwick, and this guy came into the room and it just lit up. He had this ability to electrify a room, and we've got Jerry on the call. Mention's been made of Professor Christopher Thompson. There was a whole cohort of staff there who, whether they knew it or not, were figures, characters, looked up to, an example to me and many others. And he had the voice, Jim, he had the persona, he had the ability to pull you in, whatever the subject matter was. One episode that really sticks in my mind from later on in our first year was a research seminar that Jim gave to the French department at Warwick on the 1995 presidential election. And I went along, I was interested. There weren't many students in the room, but students were encouraged to go. Jim gave the talk. He asked questions, and me as a sort of, slightly tedious, kind of keynote, put in my hands, and I wanted to ask a question. And about the only thing I knew about French politics at the time was Pierre Poujade and Poujadism, because I'd done a bit of it. I think might have written an essay on it. So I sort of asked my kind of question about the connection between the 1995 presidential election and Poujade. And of course, there wasn't really one, but Jim welcomed the question, kind of politely pointed out there probably wasn't a huge amount of kind of relevance between these two rather distant frames of reference, but then would have turned it, maybe something about the kind of appeal to the so-called, common man, common woman, the common person, something about anti-government populist politics, something about the left behind. And then he opened up there into some wider comments about the kind of the main event, the Chirac-Jospin second round. And it was an example that I think I've sublimated, and Craig has obviously sublimated it as well. And Jerry described this, I think, very well just now, that whatever you gave him or didn't give him, he found a way to work with it while sort of treating you with respect, whilst also kind of encouraging you. There was that real kind of work ethic. He expected a lot of you. He expected a lot of himself. So that came shining through. And then you would hear him on the radio, in the days before social media, where you can kind of proudly, humble brag your participation in whatever it is. You would hear him on the radio, that kind of inimitable voice, the gravitas, all these phrases that I want to say in Jim's voice. I won't try and do the accent here, but that kind of presence, the authority, the thoughtfulness as well. So you would hear him, and it became clear that he was a figure. And I sort of learned about him backwards in a way. So to me, he was associated with French politics. I did the Stendhal special course with Professor Thompson as well, and I've kind of wondered there if Stendhal's interest in temperaments, in literal and social climates, in the spoken and unspoken spoken languages of politics that you get in Stendhal, whether all that kind of fed in some way. But yeah, I mean, here I am at the Glasgow University campus where he did Portuguese, Spanish, as well as the French, the moral philosophy. I'm still learning now on this podcast about the kind of breadth of his expertise. Actually, it wasn't something that he was ever going to kind of show off about. You had to kind of learn about it afterwards or see it in action. There's more I could say about the football, but I've kind of waffled on quite a bit there.
You haven't waffled at all, Stephen. And can I? Yes, just we're gonna move on in the show. Pas une minute à perdre, mes chers amis. But could you just give us 30 seconds on the football, because I mean the football was hugely important for Jim.
Yeah, I mean, he cared about his job, and football was really where he came to life. So he used to drive us up to the Westwood pitches on the Warwick campus. It was only about a mile or so, but a group of us were privileged to get a lift in the Saab. And then one day a second Saab appeared in the driveway. It was wonderful. Again, I mean, he was actually a really, really excellent striker. And there was no quarter given, another Jim phrase. You know, when you were on that pitch, it was serious business. And I used to play in goal in the 5-a-side and 6-a-side pitches, and he put a fair number past me there. There's one memory that sticks in the head. We were playing 11-a-side, and we were safely 4-1 up. And so Jim released me from goal and stuck me up front with him. And I managed to score a goal. It was one of those that it sort of went in off my backside. It was much more luck than judgment. But Jim raced over to me, grasped me, gave me this massive bear hug as if, you know, I just scored for Scotland winning the World Cup or something. But it was lovely that he was really kind of willing to share that side of him. And yes, he was a very private individual. And there's all sorts of things that I never knew about him and have never asked, but have, heard through or learnt about through hearing, him speak on a podcast. There's a 2013 Aston podcast, but also hearing from colleagues on this call and elsewhere. But yeah, it was lovely to see that kind of sense of commitment and enjoyment on the football pitch. Yeah, where he was actually a really talented player.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Craig, did you want to add anything?
Because I had him as like my supervisor, but also as the warden on in the halls of residence. Sometimes there's the halls of residence thing. There was there'd be like a social event, and Jim would come round with pizza and some wine, and all the hall tutors would meet. And it's just the way in which he was able to switch between the sort of very focused and serious work persona and the thing about him working incredibly hard is absolutely true. When I'd go around for supervisions, which were much more frequent than postgraduates get now, he'd be either polishing an article or he'd be hunched over the TOSIL, that's the Hall of Residence allocations and stuff like that. But then when it came to a social event like football or like the hall tutors gathering, he just switched into that very, very, kind of avuncular, congenial mode, that life and soul of the parties. It was really a pleasure to kind of know him in a couple of different contexts.
A man of many layers. I want to move us on, pas une minute à perdre, mes chers amis, to the last phase of Jim's career, when he came back to Aston. Pam, you were head of the School of Languages and Social Sciences. Tell us about Jim's return.
Well, at the time, recruitment to languages nationally had fallen, and the school had expanded here at Aston via the creation of academic subject groups in sociology and politics and modern history. And so because those degrees in that area were extremely popular in the Birmingham area, we recruited very well. There were members of the French subject group who moved. They moved from French or German to these new social and political subject groups. And meanwhile, I was head of school, and another senior member of the French group, Dr. Beverly Adab, was my deputy. So it was very clear that we needed a new dynamic leader to really invigorate the French group.
Can you tell us a little bit about his priorities with his research, with his teaching at this time? Because he made a big impact when he came in, but he was also very focused on what he wanted to do, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Yes, I think that, people have said that he was a proud person. He was a proud person. He was very self-sufficient and independent, his own man. And during the second period at Aston, he was in great demand externally due to his strong reputation and many commitments. I'm thinking, for example, of his academic fellowships, research grants, and the numerous media interviews that he gave for organisations across the world. So none of us can do everything. You're talking about prioritisation. We have to prioritise.
Yeah.
Jim wasn't somebody who was interested in power, in management hierarchies, in committee work or administration. As you said, he was somebody who had very high expectations for himself and for his students. He was a meticulous perfectionist. He performed at his best in teaching and research.
Talking about performance, let me come to the subject of the inaugural, which he gave in April 2013. Sam, I think we've got some photos, haven't we, from the inaugural. In fact, the inaugural was really an extraordinary event.
It was a celebratory event, wasn't it? Jim's return and
Jim's
his
return
success.
with a cracking title. Where's the party? The Front National at 40. There we go. In fact, there you are, presenting the Jim at the inaugural. You can scroll through some of those photos. There's a few photos there of Jim actually delivering his speech, which perhaps capture something of that charisma and persona that relish that Craig and Stephen were talking about in terms of his teaching. If you carry on with the photos, Sam, in fact, I mean, students turned up in abundance, I think, at this inaugural. It's not that usual to see such students. Colleagues as well. In the picture there, we can see Michael Sutton, recently retired, and Christina Schaeffner on this photo, Dennis Ager on the left, and Christopher Thompson on the right. Stephen Forster and Christopher Thompson. Stephen who's on the call with us. And finally, Pam, probably wondering why she appointed me, and me looking like a man who has gone out and might have left the gas on. What I love about that photo actually is Britta, Jim's wife, there, and Alex, and there they are together. It was a family moment as well. Yes. It was a moment of triumph, and for Jim, and a wonderful delight for Britta as well, and for the wider Shields family. Pam, you stepped down in 2013, so I'm going to just pick up the threads of Jim's last years at Aston.
2015. Oh, 2013 is, yes, that's right, yes.
And head
of school.
As head of school.
Yeah.
I'm just going to walk us briefly through that, and then we'll perhaps just open up for a wider discussion. You know, Jim's teaching, the extraordinary teaching that he'd developed at Warwick, carried on here at Aston in his second phase, French language, French politics, and of course his beloved topic of Vichy France, the module that I was lucky enough to inherit when he retired. In the final years of service, you've already mentioned the Distinguished Lieberhume Research Fellowship on how extremists govern, lessons from France, looking at the FN's role in local government. We've already referred to the Hoffman Prize, of course, that the aura of that prize still continuing in this time. He and I supervise a couple of PhD students together, Jim playing nice cop to my nasty cop routine. And the second of these, Dr. Chris O'Neill, graduated in 2018, the year that Jim retired, rather serendipitously, just as Jim was stepping down. And Chris was a fellow Celtic fan, a native of Scotland. And I think, like all those that Jim had mentored, Chris found Jim immensely supportive, and very demanding, but also someone who allowed him to breathe and find his own feet with what actually was quite a complicated project. I suppose the most notable feature of the final period, and you've already alluded to this, Pam, was Jim's work in the media. So in all, he delivered over 600 interviews or took part in over 600 programs in British, French, American, South American, Canadian, Australian, East European, Chinese, Middle Eastern, and other international broadcast and print media. He appeared on the BBC, on the Today programme, the Westminster Hour, also on ABC, NBC, CNN, CBC, Sky, Reuters, and even Al Jazeera. His opinions were cited everywhere in newspapers such as Le Monde, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Newsweek. The PR office at Aston reckoned Jim's media presence was worth the equivalent of several £1 million in advertising investment. It was publicity for the institution that just could not be bought. I want to open things up before we get to the post 2018. I just want to open things up to more general discussion between everyone who's with us. I wonder what Jim would have had to say about French politics in the last 12 to 18 months, but also open to wider comments on the significance of what he did and on this whole phase in the history of French studies in the UK.
Because he was so meticulous in charting the rise in support for what's now Rassemblement National and the causes of it. I don't think that much of what's happened would come as a surprise really to it, because this has been a kind of a long time in arriving, and you chart back to those original breakthroughs in European elections, but you can see it as progressively certain taboos around the far right have been shed. You can see it in the context of far right progress elsewhere in Europe as well. So like many commentators, you try and keep some of the kind of personal about it. So I imagine you'd have been very concerned, but not necessarily shocked.
Surprised. Alistair, could I bring you in, because this is sure. Your special subject, of course.
Yeah, I think the first point I would make is it's a very good question, because I don't think anybody really knows what's going on today in French politics. And that's, of course, I'm being slightly flippant, but it's an incredibly interesting period. 2024 was just an amazing year from an observer's perspective, really. And I guess Jim he was looking at Marine Le Pen a long time ago. He wrote about the transition, to Marine's leadership of the become the Rassemblement National, and I think he wouldn't be panicking. He'd be weighing it up, and I think in a sense, at one level, it would be the confirmation of a good choice of research shift back in the late 80s and early 90s. Let's face it, someone who can speak with real authority on what's going on in French politics today, and particularly in relation to the Rassemblement National. It's difficult. I've heard lots of analyses that I wouldn't particularly share, but Jim, I would, and that's really where Jim's sort of historical focus is important as well, because he's rooted in a historical understanding of what is the far right in France and in Europe, and he's also rooted in a pretty good historical understanding of how the organization of these movements has evolved. And I think the work that Jim did on local government and on local organization of the party and so on, this is important work. So I think Jim would have a better steer than most in terms of understanding the situation that, frankly, is very, very difficult to fully grasp at the moment in French politics.
He'd have loved the complexity. He'd have loved the complexity.
It would have been. I think where he might have been a little bit at odds to answer with, as all of us, it would be in relation to the, I suppose, the funding scandal and the European Parliament business, and will Marine Le Pen be able to be a candidate in the next presidential elections? Jim would have been more media centric than ever, actually, with those sort of questions coming up.
Yeah.
But I think it's actually quite difficult to read, really, French politics at the moment.
Indeed. Stephen and Jerry, can I bring you in, and Pam as well, just to talk about Jim from the teaching perspective? We've heard throughout the podcast and in the interviews that I did with people beforehand, words coming up like charisma, persona, relish, performance. I think probably if you look at any standard teaching guide or standard guide for teaching in higher education, that's not the sort of vocabulary that you'll see. Have we lost our way in some respects in higher education teaching? Should we be also trying to take in, other models, other patterns of teaching that draw on these more, let's say, intuitive approaches to communication that Jim seems to have mastered so brilliantly?
I think that's quite important now that we become, I shouldn't say we because I've retired, but universities have become more dependent on remote learning, use of computers and so on. And what was so important about Jim was that he was a good listener. He was genial. He was generous with his time. He valued everybody's opinion. They knew that he did. And students found him very warm, very supportive. When you talk to students, and I think we've all talked to students about Jim, the things that they tell you are quite striking. It's little things to do with a relationship where they really bonded with the personality. They responded to him personally. And you need the face-to-face contact, I think, very often for that sort of relationship. I spoke recently to somebody who was a student at Aston in those very early years. And she told me she still keeps some of the written work that she produced for Jim at that time because she was absolutely thrilled to read the extensive comments that he gave on the work, the encouragement that he wrote directly to her. And that was what prompted her to go on to an academic career. And I think this sort of personal electricity, the relationship between people is something that Jim was very good at communicating and bonding in that way.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I bring you in? I noticed a smile when I raised the question there. Have we lost our way in the way we try to teach people to teach?
I think in some ways, and I took a note on this when Jerry was first talking. It's interesting what Pam says there about that the handwritten. We often say in the school that it was quicker and easier and probably more personal to mark language work for our students in the good old days of pen and paper than trying to sort of wrestle with the virtual learning platforms. I'm the first to kind of acknowledge and have benefited from those, that charisma, the relish. Jim had really serious expertise. So it's the combination of the expertise along with the ethics and the values that I think are crucial in and of themselves, and something of a contrast with that kind of quite technocratic expectation that we innovate, that we theorize. Not to say those things should be done and don't have their place in teaching, but the other thing I would add is that although Jim is the sort of version of his kind, there are many other ways of being a kind of engaging teacher. It's not to say that for charisma you've got to be a kind of Jim Shields type or nothing else, but I think he would probably be the first to say, well, he was him, but you've got to kind of find your own way. The other thing I would add, just as reflections, and feel free to edit this out, so two things. One is the kind of really striking point here about Aston and Warwick, both as centres of some really extraordinary individuals and cohorts, and certainly Warwick was hugely influential in my career, and I certainly would not have gone on to do a PhD and gone into academia without the Warwick experience. And the second thing is just that actually remarkable breadth that Jim had. So he was a feted teacher. He was respected and feted as a scholar in languages and in political science, the Hoffman Prize, as a media presenter. There's a lot of emphasis these days on cross-disciplinary working, for all sorts of good reasons. But, again, as a sort of example, I don't know if cross-disciplinary working was something Jim particularly kind of thought about, but just as a sort of reflection of the intrinsic, motivation and interest, desire to kind of find out and to work as a teacher and as a researcher. I think, it's only really in this podcast that kind of I've reached a new level of, I think, respect really for just the breadth of expertise that he had.
Jerry, you worked very closely with Jim. I suppose you must have seen some of that breadth developing over those 20 years when he was at Warwick.
And there was a sort of big hinterland. I'm just thinking it wasn't the kind of breadth that would dilute across.
No.
And he had his 18th, his rooted his 18th century from his thesis and his modern French politics, and that's what he would teach, and he'd be all across what he was teaching. It wasn't a kind of charisma that was covering up a vacuity, if you like. And I guess just to, who knows who'll listen to this, but just to sort of reinforce what Stephen said, I really wouldn't want to set up Jim, and nor would he himself, as the only style of teaching. And I've seen Jim relating to other colleagues who have a much quieter way of teaching and actually, seeing the virtues of that. It's not everyone can be Jim, though ironically I can imagine Craig and Stephen taking some of Jim's sort of style and pulling it off. And the only other thing I was going to say was, yes, a combination of the students loved him, but boy, was he demanding. There wasn't anywhere to hide if you weren't pulling your weight as a student. You must have had that, Craig, as a supervisee.
There was literally nowhere to hide, because I used to leave my room on the Hall of Residence to go to the supermarket at Warwick over at Cannon Park. He had to walk by Jim's house to get there, and every time I'd try and sneak past, because he might come out and he'd be like, "Piggy, we've not got time for this, you've got to be getting on with your thesis." Oh God, I was in court again by him. So he was quite demanding, and it took me a long time actually to become a decent postgraduate. So I imagine that was quite a challenge for him.
Let me just add, just bringing the discussion to a close. My memory, or one of my memories of Jim, just in those last years when he was teaching, he still took hours and hours to prepare each class. He worked really hard at his teaching, even in those, let's call them, the last phase, the twilight years of his career. He was still meticulously going through the preparation, going through the information and revising things and thinking through things. I think that's a sign of immense integrity. It's also a sign, though, that he was not interested in this fast stream of rather shallow productivist teaching, which sometimes the system can encourage us towards. He wanted to deliver something good for his students, and he wasn't going to compromise on that, no matter how busy he was with other things. I'm going to move on to the last phase, just rather briefly now. Jim left Aston in 2018, an early retirement, which allowed him to spend his last years with his family, his wife Britta, and the children Alex and Lena, of whom he was so proud. What was not known by his colleagues was that Jim had already been fighting a rare and aggressive cancer since 1994. When you consider what such experiences must involve, it makes his achievements, the achievements we've been talking through, over the previous 30 years, all the more remarkable. Speaking personally, I last exchanged messages with Jim on Burns Night in 2023, just a couple of weeks before he died. I sent him a video of a piper that I'd spotted that morning just off Birmingham's Corporation Street. And Jim, who must have been very poorly at the time, replied with his customary good humour. If you knew Jim, you'd know what I mean there. I could hear the words. It was on WhatsApp. I could hear the words in his deep Scottish rumble. The piper's made of stirring stuff. But so was Jim. And sorry, Pam, you wanted to...
No, I was just going to say that what people have contributed today it corresponds so closely to my personal
Memories.
memories of Jim, which centre very much on his passionate enthusiasm for work. And though I don't play football, I hear a lot about it, also for football, and an irrepressible sense of fun. I mean, his laughter was really infectious, and that's one of the things I remember most, having a good laugh with Jim.
Yeah. So we come to the final chapter. Jim died a couple of weeks after that Burns night. His funeral from St. Peter's Catholic Church in Bristol, I think a sign of the comfort that he took in a return to the Catholic sacraments of his Lanarkshire childhood. And so we come to the end of this story, this account of Jim's life. It has been, as I said at the beginning, it can only have been a partial account, like all histories. But hopefully that's also suggested the many layers of someone who was an inspiring colleague and an inspiring teacher and a dear friend and mentor to many. I'd like to conclude with thanks. Warmest thanks to my guests on the podcast, Professor Pam Moores, Professor Stephen Forster, Professor Jerry Ahern, Professor Alistair Cole, who had to leave us, Dr. Craig Blunt. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Let me also add thanks as well to Dr. Chris O'Neill, Dr. David Lees, Professor Christopher Thompson, who all spoke to me about their memories of Jim, but most especially to Dr. Britta Shields-Martins, Jim's wife, and Mrs. Selena Doherty, Jim's sister, all of whom, as I say, shared with me their memories of Jim as we were preparing for the podcast. Thank you very much to Sam, the producer in the background, who's been grappling with technical problems throughout, I think, but as stoic as ever. Thanks, Sam. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Right Past Brilliant Future, and please join us for another show, another time, to hear more stories about Aston history, to hear about the history of the university and about the kind of history work that we're doing. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.